welcome to Power and Policy, a Canadian Muslim Public Affairs Council podcast aimed at engaging, informing, and empowering Canadian Muslims on key issues that are facing our country. I'm your host, Janella Massa, and today we are talking about freedom of expression and the recent attempts to restrict it. It's an issue that's becoming quite urgent as the environment for civil liberties is shifting dramatically. In Toronto, a so-called bubble bylaw has come into effect. It restricts protests within 50 meters of certain facilities, including schools, hospitals, and places of worship. But it has some asking, who is it actually keeping safe? We have a panel of guests today to discuss. First, joining us in studio is Rabbi David Mivasair. He's an active member of Independent Jewish Voices Canada, as well as CMPAC Board Chair Dr. Yaser Haddara here in studio. And in Ottawa, Tim McSorley, National Coordinator of the International Civil Liberties Monitoring Group. Thanks to all three of you for being with us today. So I'm going to start with Tim, who is joining us virtually. Tim, since, the October 7th attacks and the subsequent war on Gaza, we've seen here in Canada, across the world, really, hundreds of protests. Here in Toronto, that number in the dozens, people speaking up across the country against genocide, calling on their governments to take action. And many have faced backlash. Some would call it an attack on civil liberties. Can you speak a little bit about how you see it? Do you characterize it that way?
Thanks. And yes, definitely, we see it as an attack on civil liberties across Canada. The amount of crackdowns, of vitriol, of attacks on protests expressing dissented opposition to the genocide in Gaza in support of Palestinian human rights has been really abhorrent, and it's really sent a chill throughout communities across the country who are speaking out. And it isn't just a chill and just words; it's also charges against individuals, excessive charges for simply postering on buildings of businesses that may be financially funding the genocide. It's about the establishment of these no-go zones in different parts of Toronto. It's about the excessive use of force by police at protests in Montreal and in Ottawa and in Toronto and in other cities. The clearing of encampments in Calgary and Edmonton within 24 hours, really using, again, excessive force there. And the characterization of these protests that are by and large peaceful, that are by and large expressing a clear statement calling for justice and the support of human rights and international human rights law, being characterized somehow as being across the board expressions of hate or of expressions of support for terrorism coming from our political leaders, from journalists, and from community leaders is really undermined the ability for individuals to engage in free expression and freedom of association and of protest for something that is really, one of the key issues facing, Canada and the world today. There's always concerns around issues of violence, of hate speech, and those need to be addressed. But they can be addressed in a way that doesn't limit freedom of expression, freedom of protest, and being able to engage in these protected acts. But we haven't seen that in Canada.
Let me bring that similar question here to Rabbi David. We've heard, as we heard Tim say there, the characterization of these protests: violent, hateful, anti-Semitic, all of these words. When you're out at protests, crowds in the hundreds, how would you describe those protests and what's been your experience?
Yeah, it's nothing like that. I've been in protests with 10,000 people in Mississauga. And no, of course, it's ridiculous to even say that. Of course, no violence, no hatred, no threats, no intimidation. Those are words that are used to distract and deflect from the real issue, which is what Israel's doing to people in Gaza and people throughout Palestine. So that's where the real violence is. And, the reason why we need to go in the streets and protest is because a way of communicating with our members of parliament are kind of blocked to us. They don't listen, they don't respond, right? If we had access And if we had a reasonable kind of relationship with the people leading our government, we wouldn't be in the streets doing this. We would invite them to have dinner with us as other groups do, or we might take them on a free trip to Palestine and let them see for themselves what's going on. But that it doesn't work that way. So I'm making a point about why people end up protesting in the streets at all.
Mm.
And it's mostly because they don't have another effective means of having their message being taken into account.
And Rabbi, can you speak specifically to this criticism that we hear about pro-Palestinian groups, that they are inherently anti-Semitic? How do you respond to that, and what is your reaction to how that impacts freedom of expression?
Well, certainly that's not true, right? To pursue justice for Palestinians, justice also for the other people who live in that land, Jews, right? That's not anti-Semitic. I'm with an organization of Jews. There are thousands of us across Canada, independent Jewish voices, right? We're doing what our Jewish tradition and our Jewish religion teaches us, which is tzedek, tzedek, tirdof, justice, justice, you shall pursue. It's right in the Torah. That's not anti-Semitic. And the accusations of anti-Semitism are just fabricated to throw people off, to distract, to suppress. So you ask what's the implications or the outcomes of that? Is it is suppression. You see that all over. I can just give the example of a march through the streets of Toronto where somebody liked to get dressed up in a Spider-Man suit. That was just a thing that a guy did, and pretending that he's Spider-Man, I guess he climbs on buildings or something. And he did that in front of a hospital that was started by Jewish organizations, and that turned into an accusation of anti-Semitism. They're completely wild, totally unfounded, unfactual accusations that he went into the hospital and intimidated people. The prime minister ended up speaking about it. So that false fabrication and manipulation of that accusation of anti-Semitism is used to shut down these protests. I understand from a civil liberties point of view, they are making restrictions on our right of assembly and our right to expression, but that's not really the real issue. The real issue is about Palestine,
Mm.
right? They're trying to silence actually kind of honest, thoughtful discourse around a public issue that people should be involved with.
And I think we should point out that when you're talking about pro-Palestinian human rights, we're talking about criticism of a state's actions, the state of Israel, not of the Jewish faith.
It's got nothing to do with the Jewish faith, and I would also say it's not about Jewish people. It's not about Jews as Jews. So there's this effort to conflate Jews with the state of Israel. The state of Israel proclaims itself to be the state of the Jewish people, but nobody asked me, did I want that? Did I vote for that? Do I sign up for that? No, it's a political entity, so it's extremely proper and valid and necessary, not just to criticize it, but to actually shut it down, and that's not in any way about Jews as Jews, and certainly nothing about our religion whatsoever.
Dr. Haddara, I want to bring you into this conversation, and let's talk specifically about this so-called bubble bylaw that restricts protests outside of certain institutions, including schools, hospitals, and places of worship. Some would argue, look, this is just about protecting, vulnerable community. Could be young students, could be in a hospital, in a place of worship. Maybe even Muslims would be the ones who are needing to be protected from protests outside of a sacred space. What's your response to that? That this is just about protecting communities?
So the weaponization of fear by politicians is nothing new. Politicians will take fear and insecurity, sometimes things that are there for legitimate reasons, and they will capitalize on them, and they will use them to create a wedge or to create an issue that can gain them votes and support, and disregard the divisiveness that creates in society and the long-term consequences of trampling on rights and trading security for rights. So if we were to consider what's been discussed here, you can take an example of somebody shows up at a say a Jewish day school, and they want to stand there and they want to protest and they want to raise banners and shout slogans and create an atmosphere that is intimidating and harassing. That would be something that's horrible. It's reprehensible. But the same law that purports to protect schools, how would that law then deal with, say, students in a public school who want to step out of their classes? They want to organize a walkout and they want to organize a protest right outside their own school.
Mm.
And the trouble with the way that these laws have been proposed and the ones that have been passed is that they don't make a distinction. They are not well thought out, they are not well articulated, they are not specific to the situations that really should be addressed. And so we have to realize we do have a Canadian Charter of Rights and we do have the Canadian Criminal Code, and those are adequate. The laws on the books are adequate to deal with issues of actual harassment, actual bullying, actual intimidation. If anything, we've seen overreach by police implementing these laws. If there is a problem that needs to be addressed, and if we want to solve an actual real problem in our community, that solution has to be well thought out. It has to be well studied. It has to have adequate consultation, an adequate balance between the rights that need to be protected and the safety that needs to be achieved. But absent all of that, what we are seeing is simply the weaponization, fear, and insecurity, and it's driving further deterioration, further divisiveness in our community.
Rabbi David, I'll just ask you to jump in here. Dr. Haddara talked about, if we're trying to solve a problem, and the question becomes, what problem were we trying to solve with this? And I also want to raise the point of some of the protests that did happen outside of places of worship and what was happening inside of those places of worship.
Yeah.
What part of the conversation needs to be brought in when we talk about a sacred space, but what's happening inside those sacred
Yeah,
spaces?
exactly. Just to make explicit what you're talking about, all of this came from incidents last year. I was there. I was part of organizing it. There's other Jewish people with me, along with Palestinians and many other allies. When there are commercial real estate companies that sell properties, some of which are located inside 1948 Israel, and some of them are in the occupied Palestinian territories, occupied since 1967, and they're essentially selling stolen property. And that was actually organized to be held in a public building in Vaughan.
And is this illegal? What's happening?
Well, let me just say a little more. It was going to be in a public building,
Mm.
and because we objected to that, the public building didn't allow it, so the organizers moved it into a synagogue. And once it was in a synagogue, we decided to protest that, to bring attention to it. We were across the street. We were peaceful, weren't threatening, but we let them know we're coming. We also let the police know that stolen property is being sold. You just asked me, is that illegal? That's really probably a question for lawyers and a judge. Is it illegal to sell stolen property? I would just pose the question. Suppose a band of car thieves were selling stolen cars in the synagogue's parking lot, and some of us had a protest against selling stolen cars in a synagogue's parking lot. Would all this be happening? This is all about Palestine, all about privileging Zionism. This has nothing to do with keeping anyone in Canada safe from anything. There was no one praying in that synagogue. No one was studying Torah. No one was getting married. There wasn't a funeral. There was a real estate sale of stolen property. And to protect that, Stephen Del Duca, who's the mayor of Vaughan, that day said that he would ask a city council to pass a law to keep people safe when they're going to their house of worship. Then they expanded it to include so many other so-called vulnerable institutions: schools, hospitals, daycare centers, congregate care facilities. And city council hurried up really fast and passed that law on June 25th last year. It's less than a year ago. And since then, CEJA, the Canada, the Center for Israel and Jewish Affairs, has spread that across the country. I just had a conversation with someone who talked about this popping up everywhere. It's not popping up anywhere. There's a massive lobbying effort to get municipalities, provinces, and even the federal government of Canada to institute these bans, basically as a reaction to us protesting against using a synagogue to shield what I would consider to be illegal. It's certainly immoral. And that's where this all comes from. There should be no mistake about it. It's a complete pretense to say that it's keeping people safe. As Dr. Haddara said, we already have laws on the books covering everything: intimidation, threatening, blocking sidewalks, blocking streets. No. Besides, we don't do that. That's not what it's about.
I want to bring Tim into this conversation because I don't want to diminish the idea of protecting religious groups, whether that is Jewish groups, Muslim groups, any group. We're talking about vulnerable populations, people in hospitals. I mean, we think about the protests that were happening outside of hospitals during COVID. Protesting outside of school. I could see, on its face, people saying, "Look, this." There's an opportunity for us to make sure that these folks are protected in other scenarios. How do we find that balance? Where do we draw that line?
Thanks. Yeah. Well, I think the example you gave of COVID is an interesting one because there were temporary targeted restrictions around protests that blocked access into and threatened and physically threatened the staff of hospitals. But those were temporary, and it was clear what the actual issue was. And they weren't meant to be long lasting. They weren't meant to either be permanent or last for an entire year. And they were based on clear and actual threats. What we're seeing right now with the new bylaws that are being brought in Vaughan and Toronto, for example, that it's simply I have the wording here that it's the expressing disapproval concerning a person's attendance at that infrastructure or discouraging a person's attendance. These broad words that really could encapsulate almost anything that an individual says in terms of a political criticism of their participation in an event, in terms of just expressing their own political opinion, not even necessarily saying that you shouldn't go in there or stop, but just saying that I wouldn't go in there. That's a discouragement. So these laws are incredibly broad. And so clearly the goal isn't to protect those who are at the most risk. Rather, it's to limit, expression. It's to limit assembly. It's to limit protest and dissent. There are other things that the government has been doing in terms of providing funding for religious institutions in order to ensure that their facilities are secure and things like that. And so there's other measures that are more targeted and more legitimate and that don't infringe on freedom of expression that could be explored. But that's not what we're seeing put in place right now. The charter is based on a balance of reasonable restrictions. So we've had restrictions on freedom of expression in the past, and they exist in other laws, but they have to be based on a reasonableness. And fundamentally, what's being proposed here by these bubble bylaws or essentially no-go zones for protest bans, doesn't meet that threshold. It's important that we recognize that there are powers, as Dr. Haddara and Rabbi David have said, that already allow police, if there are acts of hate, if there are acts of violence, to take action. We'd be concerned if, again, the police engage in an over-enforcement of any laws. But the bylaws that have been adopted, the federal law that's being proposed by the Liberal government already, are unnecessary and redundant and are clearly politically motivated in this current context. We didn't see them during protests outside of libraries against drag brunches. or drag story time. We haven't seen these politicians and community leaders speak up to ban, and protect communities when we've seen other similar actual threats against communities. But now we're seeing it, and it's coming out of this context that's already being explained by the other two guests really clearly, of wanting to clamp down on speech that criticizes the Canadian government and criticizes those who are enabling and supporting the genocide in Gaza.
Mm. So, Tim, in your view, do you see any version of this type of legislation as appropriate, or are there safeguards or wordings that you think would allow it to be more specific in terms of protecting groups, or do you think it's not necessary and there are other avenues and means that can achieve that outcome?
It's not necessary. Already there are laws in place where if a group is organizing a protest and they're being threatening, they're saying we're going to storm and we're going to injure and we're going to occupy. We already see on a regular basis, and we criticize that as well for police overreach, but that police do have the tools to take action. When there's been, for example, protests outside of MPs' offices around their support or lack of action in regards to the in regards to Palestinian human rights, the police have been called in, and they've stopped those protests. They've ensured access to the offices, um, and so the powers are there already. We see them being overused and abused. We don't need these new powers that add another level of penalizing and of repression of free expression and free assembly.
That begs the question, is it too late now with this bylaw here? We hear about attempts to bring it into other cities. And what can folks do if they feel compelled to fight it?
So it's like any other issue of policy. We have to advocate on policy, and we have to oppose these laws that are ill thought out. And again, I think that the point that Tim made is extremely important. It's all about reasonableness. It's all about the balance of the rights and freedoms and restrictions. And so we have to oppose things that are overreaching. We have to oppose this kind of blunt, bludgeon approach that quashes freedom of expression rather than articulating the very specific challenges. I love the example that you brought up, and Tim commented on it, that of the protests in hospitals, because what was stopped there is anything that would threaten staff or threaten their access. So these are very specific issues to be addressed. So what can we do? We have to oppose the existing these existing laws that overreach, and we have to advocate, more importantly, at the municipal level, at the provincial level, at the federal level. We have to, as organizations and as individuals, we have to connect with our politicians, and we have to make sure that whether laws or actual implementation and policy, that there is no overreach, and we have to make sure that any changes are done only with appropriate consultation and with an appropriate consideration of the balance of these different issues.
Rabbi David, before we wrap up, can you just bring back into view exactly what these protesters are trying to draw attention to and the reality of the dire situation that they are trying to bring into focus? Here we are 18 months, I've lost count now, or a year and a half into a war, what many call a genocide. Can you just talk a little bit about what you're hearing from the people who are taking to the streets about why they are there, what
Oh,
they're fighting for?
absolutely. I imagine anyone listening to us and watching knows. I mean, I think yesterday was the 600th day of Israel inflicting a genocide on people. This is not a war. This is a one-way attack on completely innocent people. of all kinds. I mean young, old, men, women, children, people that are invalids. Of course, everybody knows, sister. Every single day, Israel's killing dozens of people. They're starving. 2 million people that don't have food, don't have water. I'm actually personally in touch with them every day with people in Gaza. The reason we're protesting is because our government is completely unresponsive. Even when they went through a kind of a farcical exercise of pretending that they were going to have an arms embargo, they didn't really do it, right? I assume you know what I'm talking about. The Liberal Party under Justin Trudeau allowed its MPs to vote in favor of an arms embargo that was so full of loopholes it really didn't stop anything, right? So this is why we have to protest, as I said before, because we don't have other means, to make the difference. It has to be made, so this is ongoing. It's dire every single day.
And it's not just what's been happening in the last few months. I mean, this is also a conversation of what's happened through decades and in the occupation and
Yes, it's
what many have called an apartheid system. There's a longer and
yes,
broader
yes.
conversation as well.
You have to ask what. Sure, probably again, everyone listening to this knows that Israel was founded in 1948 with the expulsion of something like 750,000 Palestinians from their homes. They were kicked out of their homes through violence. It was terrorism. Terrorism was introduced into this by Zionists. That's where terrorism came from.
So the
I
stakes
was
are
I
quite
was
high in
I
this.
yeah, and it's gone on since then. So what we're seeing now, in a way, it's kind of a culmination of something that began more than 80 years ago. And our government is fully complicit. Canada supplies weapons to Israel. Canada sends millions and millions of dollars of tax deducted donations that are made to look like charities. Canada allows recruitment here for the Israeli military, which is in violation of the Foreign Enlistment Act in Canada. It's directly violating Canadian law. Canada is also a party to treaties prohibiting genocide, but it's ignoring that. So again, I'm just saying, like, why do we need to protest? If our government was functioning properly, we wouldn't be protesting.
This is not some faraway issue that has nothing to do with us. Our taxpayer dollars are directly involved.
Yes,
In
absolutely.
Dr. Haddara, to that final point, why is it so important to be able to fight for this type of dissent on our streets?
Because we're responsible. What our government does in our name, and it does with our tax dollars. And because what we do elsewhere eventually comes back and hurts us here. It's Palestine is not a foreign policy issue. Palestine is about this exception that is often made by people in power when it comes to addressing rights. So today, because we are protesting an issue where the politicians are lined up on this side, they find it easy to dismiss our rights. They find it easy to quash these protests. Tomorrow it'll be something else. So there has to be consistency in respecting rights and respecting freedoms and respecting the values that we have committed to as a society.
Dr. Haddara, Rabbi David, Tim in Ottawa, thank you so much for joining us for this important conversation.
Thank you.
An enlightening one. And thank you at home for watching. You've been watching Power and Policy. I'm your host, Janelle Lamassa. Be sure to subscribe, leave us a comment, and share this episode with anyone who you think might be interested in learning more about this topic and other issues that are impacting Canadian Muslims. Thanks so much for watching. Stay engaged, stay informed, and empowered.